What if you woke up in a world with no electricity, hospitals, or modern pharmacies nearby? Imagine stepping outside and realizing that every convenience you rely on daily has completely disappeared. No instant heat, no clean water from taps, and no refrigerators stocked with food remained. This harsh reality was not fiction or a nightmare for medieval people. For them, every day meant finding ways to survive without modern technology or conveniences. Life in the Middle Ages demanded ingenuity, resilience, and skills we now rarely even consider necessary. For centuries, men and women across medieval Europe faced a world that was unforgiving and often brutal. Winters could stretch endlessly, famine could wipe out entire villages, and a single infection could mean death. But despite these challenges, they survived. And not only did they survive, they thrived enough to build kingdoms, wage wars, and lay the foundations for the modern world we live in today. How did they do it? By mastering skills that most of us have forgotten, but which could still prove life-saving in our own times if we were ever forced to return to a life stripped of modern technology. In this video, we are going to look at 10 medieval survival hacks that sound almost unbelievable to us now. They are clever, sometimes strange, and often incredibly simple, yet behind each one lies centuries of hard-earned experience. These were not tricks for convenience. They were the very tools of life and death. From creating fire with no matches, to preserving food without refrigeration, to navigating without the help of a compass or a map, medieval people relied on a set of techniques that kept them alive through famine, plague, and endless wars. So as you listen, picture the medieval world not as a distant, dusty past, but as a place alive with ingenuity. Imagine a blacksmith crouching by the forge, hammering steel and sparks flying in the darkness. Picture a weary farmer carefully rubbing salt into slabs of meat to prepare for the long, barren winter. Envision a monk in a stone-walled monastery, tending to the sick with nothing but a handful of herbs and his memory of ancient remedies. These images are not romanticized. They are the reality of a world where every action was tied to survival. And now, let us begin with the most fundamental survival skill of them all. Before anything else, before food could be cooked, before water could be purified, before warmth could be found in the dead of winter, there was fire. And medieval people knew exactly how to create it without a single match. If you were dropped into the medieval world without so much as a lighter or a box of matches, your very first challenge would be figuring out how to start a fire. And while it may seem like an impossible task today, for medieval people, it was an essential skill learned out of necessity, not choice. Fire was life. It was the difference between freezing to death in the middle of winter and living to see the next morning. It was the only way to make food not just edible, but safe, since uncooked meat and contaminated water could be a death sentence. It provided light in the darkness when the night was long and filled with dangers, and it gave people a sense of security, because the glow of a fire could ward off not just prowling animals, but also human threats who thought twice before approaching a camp ringed with flame. The most common way medieval people made fire was with flint and steel. This was not as simple as striking two rocks together, though that is the image we often have in our heads. Flint, a hard and brittle stone, was carefully chosen and struck against a piece of high-carbon steel. When done correctly, the impact shaved off tiny fragments of the steel itself, which, in that instant of being sheared away, heated up from the force and created a spark. These sparks were not the blazing flames we picture when we think of fire. They were fragile, fleeting pinpricks of heat that had to be carefully captured before they vanished. To catch these sparks, medieval people relied on tinder. But not just any dry grass or scrap of wood would do. They often carried prepared materials, the most effective of which was something called char cloth. This was made by taking natural fabric, usually linen or cotton, and partially burning it in a sealed container so that it turned into a delicate blackened material that could catch even the faintest spark. A single spark landing on char cloth would glow, faintly at first, but if you gently blew on it, feeding it with oxygen, that tiny ember would begin to grow. Once the ember was alive, it could be placed into a bundle of tinder, dry grass, bark shavings, or other flammable fibers, which, with careful breathing, would burst into flame. This process demanded patience, precision, and practice. A medieval traveler or soldier could not afford to be careless with their fire-starting materials. A spark wasted meant valuable time lost, and in cold or wet conditions, it could mean disaster. So people often carried not just flint and steel, but also a small pouch of prepared tinder, guarded as carefully as food or water. In some regions, fungus from birch trees, known as amadou, was prized for its ability to catch sparks and smolder for long periods, effectively acting as a portable ember that could be reignited into flame hours later. But why go through so much trouble? Because without fire, nothing else in the medieval survival playbook worked. You couldn't boil water to make it safe to drink, you couldn't preserve or cook food properly, and you couldn't keep the darkness at bay. It was not only a tool, but a symbol of life itself. Even in medieval culture and religion, fire carried immense meaning, representing both destruction and protection, both divine judgment and human endurance. So imagine yourself in a forest, clearing 1,000 years ago. The sun has set, the air is turning cold, and the night is alive with sounds. Wolves in the distance, the creak of branches above you, the unsettling thought of raiders or thieves moving through the dark. You kneel on the ground with flint in one hand, steel in the other, striking again and again until finally, one perfect spark lands on your charcloth. You cradle it like it is the most precious thing in the world, feeding it with your breath, and then suddenly, there it is. A flame, fragile at first but quickly growing, until the fire is alive and your survival is secured. That was hack number 1. Fire without matches, a skill as old as humanity itself, but in the Middle Ages, it was sharpened to an art of necessity. And with fire secured, medieval people could move on to their next challenge, preserving food in a world where refrigeration did not exist. Once a fire was made, the next question was simple but urgent. How do you keep food from rotting before you can eat it? In our modern world, the answer is automatic. We toss it in the refrigerator, wrap it in plastic, or put it in the freezer where it might last weeks or months. But in the Middle Ages, there were no humming machines keeping food cool, no airtight packaging, and no reliable way to stop meat from spoiling after just a day or two. And yet, people had to eat, not just today, but tomorrow, and for weeks into the winter when fresh food was scarce. The answer to this problem was one of the oldest and most ingenious survival tools known to humanity: salt. Salt was not just a seasoning in medieval times. It was life itself, so valuable that wars were fought over it, and entire trade routes existed solely to transport it. Salt preserved meat and fish in a way that nothing else could, by drawing the moisture out of it and creating an environment where bacteria struggled to grow. For a medieval farmer or fisherman, salt was the closest thing to a refrigerator they would ever know. And when you think about survival, this single resource might have been more important than gold. The process of preservation was straightforward, but it required careful attention. Meat or fish would be cleaned, cut, and then heavily coated in salt, sometimes layered in barrels where the salt could seep deep into every corner. Over days and weeks, the salt would cure the flesh, making it last far beyond its natural limit. The result was often tough and briny, but it was safe to eat, and that mattered far more than taste. For long journeys, whether a merchant caravan, a band of soldiers on campaign, or a group of fishermen at sea, salted provisions were the difference between survival and starvation. In coastal towns, entire industries revolved around this method. Fishermen would catch enormous hauls of herring or cod, then immediately preserve them in salt so they could be stored, transported, and sold far from the sea. These barrels of salted fish traveled across Europe, feeding cities and armies alike. For inland farmers, the same method applied to pork, beef, or game meat. Once salted, it could carry them through the cold months when fresh food was impossible to find. Salted food became so central to life that it shaped economies, diets, and even politics. A shortage of salt could lead to famine. A plentiful supply could mean security. And this wasn't just about practicality. It was about survival during the hardest times of year. Winter was merciless in medieval Europe. Crops could not grow, wild game was scarce, and the ground was too hard to dig. Families gathered around their fires, eating the food they had managed to preserve in the warm months, often relying on salted stores to see them through until spring. Without salt, Entire villages could have collapsed during these lean seasons. Salt's importance was so great that it influenced language and culture. The word salary, for example, comes from the Latin salarium, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. Even centuries later, in the medieval period, salt retained its almost mystical reputation as a symbol of health, wealth, and preservation. In Christian rituals, salt was blessed and used as a purifier, showing just how deeply people associated it with life and protection. So picture a medieval household preparing for the long months ahead. The butchered meat lies on wooden tables, and with practiced hands, family members rub coarse grains of salt into every cut. The air is heavy with the smell of brine, and the knowledge that without this work, there might be nothing to eat in February. Barrels are sealed, stored in cool places, and watched carefully, because inside those wooden containers lies the family's lifeline against hunger. The taste of that meat months later may have been harsh, overly salty, and sometimes even unpleasant, but no one complained, because it meant they were alive. That was hack number 2, salt, the medieval refrigerator. It was simple, effective, and so essential that entire civilizations depended on it. And once food was stored and preserved, the next step in survival was to treat the inevitable injuries and illnesses of daily life. But without hospitals or antibiotics, how could medieval people heal? The answer lay in nature itself, in a collection of remedies we now call herbal first aid. Even with fire for warmth and salt to keep food from rotting, life in the Middle Ages was never safe from the constant shadow of injury and illness. A single infected cut could claim a life. A fever could burn through an entire household. And unlike us, medieval people did not have the luxury of hospitals stocked with antibiotics, painkillers, or sterile bandages. Yet they were not helpless. Out of necessity, they developed a rich knowledge of plants and natural remedies, what we might call herbal first aid, that allowed them to treat wounds, soothe pain, and sometimes even cure disease. This knowledge was not written down in every village, but passed orally from generation to generation, preserved in the memories of healers, monks, and wise women who understood that survival depended on the gifts of nature. One of the most powerful remedies available to them was something we still recognize today: honey. Medieval people understood that honey could be more than a sweetener. When applied to wounds, it worked as an antiseptic, keeping infection at bay and helping injuries heal more quickly. In an era where a simple scratch could lead to sepsis, this was no small discovery. Garlic, too, was treasured, not only as food, but as medicine. It was crushed and applied to wounds, used to treat respiratory problems, and even believed to strengthen the body against illness. Willow bark, stripped from the tree and brewed into a tea, was one of the earliest forms of pain relief, containing the same chemical compound later refined into aspirin. These were not superstitions, they were real, functional treatments that saved lives. In monasteries, where literacy was higher and knowledge could be preserved, monks kept detailed herbals, collections of remedies describing which plants could cure which ailments. A monk tending a sick brother in a stone infirmary might grind mint to soothe the stomach, or prepare chamomile to calm nerves and encourage sleep. Yarrow was used to stop bleeding. Plantain leaves were bound into poultices for cuts and insect bites. Even nettles, a plant most people avoided for its sting, were boiled into tonics thought to strengthen the blood. Though their understanding of disease was limited, medieval medicine still leaned heavily on humoral theory and spiritual belief. The practical effects of these treatments were undeniable. But herbal first aid was not limited to monasteries. In villages and towns, there were women known for their healing skills, often called wise women or cunning folk. They carried knowledge of the fields and forests, knowing exactly when to harvest herbs, how to dry and store them, and how to prepare them for use. These women were indispensable in their communities, called upon to treat everything from childbirth complications to fevers, and though their knowledge was sometimes viewed with suspicion, it was also deeply respected. A single healer might be the reason a village endured an outbreak of sickness. Imagine the scene. A boy has cut his hand badly while helping his father chop wood. His family knows that without care, the wound could fester. They rush to the healer, who sits in her small cottage lined with hanging bundles of dried herbs. She cleans the wound with honey, packs it with crushed garlic and binds it with cloth. She gives the boy a tea brewed from willow bark to ease the pain. Days later, instead of losing his hand or his life, the boy is back at work. For them, this was not magic, nor was it modern science. It was survival, the kind built on centuries of trial and error with the plants that grew around them. Herbal remedies were not perfect, of course. People still died of infections we could easily treat today. But for countless medieval men, women, and children, these practices made the difference between life and death. They turned nature into medicine and knowledge into power. That was hack number 3. Herbal first aid, the wisdom of plants turned into tools for survival. And if food and wounds could be managed, the next crucial task was ensuring that the most basic need of all, clean water, did not turn into a source of deadly disease. Water, more than anything else, was the foundation of survival. You could last weeks without food, but only a handful of days without water. And yet, in the medieval world, water was not always the safe and clean resource we imagine it to be. Streams could be fouled by animal waste, rivers contaminated by towns upstream, and stagnant ponds swarming with bacteria invisible to the eye, but lethal to the body. People often lived in fear of what they could not see, because they knew, though they lacked the science to explain it, that drinking the wrong water could bring on fevers, stomach cramps, or even death. Despite this, medieval people did not simply resign themselves to poisoning. They developed clever methods to make water safer, even if they did not understand the microbiology behind it. The most direct method was boiling. Once fire was secured, water could be heated until it rolled and bubbled, a simple act that destroyed many of the pathogens lurking within it. Travelers knew this, soldiers knew it, and households did it when they suspected water was untrustworthy. But boiling required fuel, which was not always plentiful. Wood had to be gathered, fires had to be maintained, and in desperate times people sought other ways. This is where medieval ingenuity appeared in subtler forms. One method was filtration through cloth or natural materials. A piece of linen, a strip of wool, or even a handful of sand and charcoal could act as a crude filter. The water was poured through these makeshift sieves, which trapped dirt, insects, and some impurities. Of course, it was not perfect, but it reduced the risk enough to make a difference. In villages, water drawn from a well might be strained before use, while travelers on the road sometimes carried pouches of cloth precisely for this purpose. When combined with boiling, the system made water far safer. But perhaps the most curious and widespread medieval solution was to avoid plain water altogether. Instead, people often drank weak ale or diluted wine, which were safer because the brewing and fermentation process killed harmful microbes. This is why even children were often given small beer rather than untreated water. It contained very little alcohol, but was far less likely to carry disease. For wealthier households, wine was the choice, mixed with water to stretch its use, while in poorer villages, ale brewed in nearly every home became the staple drink of daily life. In this way, alcohol was not about intoxication but survival, an unrecognized tool of water purification. Picture a medieval traveler stopping at a village well. He eyes the water warily, aware that a careless sip might mean sickness days later on the road. He pulls a strip of cloth from his bag, pours the water slowly through it into a wooden cup, then sets it by the fire he has already lit. Hours later, he drinks not the raw, risky water, but a boiled and filtered version that might keep him alive for the rest of his journey. Or picture a child at supper, a clay mug in hand, sipping not plain water but small beer, brewed earlier that week by her mother. To us it might seem strange, but to them it was as natural as turning on a tap today. Water was always a gamble in the Middle Ages, but these practices tipped the odds in favor of survival. Fire boiled away danger, cloth and charcoal filtered out impurities, and ale or wine offered a safer alternative to a contaminated stream. It was not perfect, but it was enough. That was hack number 4. Medieval water purification. And once you had fire to keep warm, food salted for storage, medicine from herbs, and water safe to drink, you still needed another tool to endure the unpredictable hardships of medieval life. Something so simple, yet so versatile, that it might be the most underestimated survival hack of them all. The cloak. If you imagine the medieval world, one image rises again and again. a figure cloaked against the wind, a rough woolen garment wrapped tightly around their body. To modern eyes, the cloak might look like nothing more than a piece of clothing, a relic of old fashion, but in the Middle Ages it was far more than that. It was one of the most versatile survival tools a person could own. In a world where belongings were few, where a single object might serve many functions, the cloak was a companion, a shield, and sometimes even a lifeline. The most obvious role of the cloak was warmth. Medieval winters could be merciless, and for peasants, travelers, or soldiers on campaign, the cold was one of the greatest threats to survival. Wool cloaks, heavy and tightly woven, trapped body heat and offered protection against biting winds. At night, when bedding was scarce or travel forced someone to sleep outdoors, a cloak became a blanket. It could be pulled over the head, tucked under the body, and used to hold in every scrap of warmth. For someone huddled beside a fire or even without one, that cloak was the difference between a restless night and never waking at all. But warmth was only the beginning. A cloak could act as shelter when none was available. Spread across branches, it became a makeshift tent against rain. Laid on the ground, it served as bedding, insulating the body from cold, damp earth. Travelers caught in storms would crouch beneath their cloaks, letting the thick wool deflect water and shield them from wind. In this way, it wasn't just clothing but portable shelter, carried always on the shoulders. Cloaks also doubled as camouflage and protection. A peasant in the forest might draw their cloak close and blend into the shadows, the natural dyes and earthy colors helping them vanish from sight. For soldiers, a cloak could blunt a sword's edge or absorb part of a blow. While not armor, it offered some defense, and many soldiers valued their cloak as much as their shield. A hooded cloak, drawn low over the face, provided anonymity, allowing the traveler to move unseen through busy towns or along lonely roads where bandits lurked. And then there was its role as a carrier. A cloak could be used to bundle goods, grain, fruit, or kindling when no sack was available. It could cradle a child, carry firewood, or hold foraged plants. In emergencies, it even served as a bandage or sling, wrapped around wounds or broken limbs. In essence, the cloak was the medieval version of a multi-tool, one object fulfilling a dozen needs, always ready, always close. Picture a knight returning from campaign, weary from the road. His cloak is stiff with dust, but as the sun sets and the air cools, he spreads it across the ground, sits upon it, and wraps the rest around his shoulders. Or imagine a peasant family, their hut leaking during a storm. They huddle beneath a shared cloak, its wool soaked but still warm, keeping the family dry enough to endure until morning. For both rich and poor, this humble garment was as essential as food or fire. That was hack number 5, the cloak as a multi-tool. A garment so adaptable that it became an extension of the body itself. In an age of scarcity, its value was not measured in style, but in survival. And with shelter secured, the next challenge was hunger. When food was scarce, medieval people turned to another clever survival strategy, stretching what little they had into meals that could feed many. If there is one thing that defined the daily struggle of medieval survival, it was hunger. Crops could fail, winters could drag on, and a poor harvest could mean the difference between life and death for entire villages. Food was precious, never wasted, and people became experts in making small amounts last as long as possible. This was not about feasting or fine dining. It was about survival. Out of necessity came ingenuity, and medieval people developed clever ways to stretch their meals, feeding many mouths with little more than scraps. The foundation of this survival strategy was the humble pot of stew. A cauldron would hang over the hearth, simmering day after day, its contents constantly changing as new ingredients were added and old ones consumed. Meat, bones, vegetables, grains, whatever was available went in, and the flavors deepened over time. This was not a meal cooked once and finished. It was a living dish, replenished and reused, sometimes for weeks. The broth grew richer as bones released their marrow, turning water into nourishment. A single rabbit or chicken could be stretched to feed a family for days, not by being roasted and eaten at once, but by being boiled into a soup that multiplied itself with each ladle of grain or root vegetable thrown in. Then there was porridge, another cornerstone of medieval survival. Grains such as oats, barley, or rye could be boiled into a thick, filling mush that provided energy and warmth. It was cheap, versatile, and could be flavored with whatever was on hand. Milk when available, honey for the lucky, herbs for the resourceful. In hard times, porridge was eaten plain, sustaining if not exciting. In better times, it became the canvas for small luxuries. Either way, it was the dish that filled stomachs when meat and vegetables were scarce. Bread, too, played a central role, not just as food, but as a tool. For the poor, bread was often dark and coarse, made from rye or barley rather than the fine white wheat enjoyed by the wealthy. Yet it was hearty, and more importantly, it was used as an edible plate. Thick slabs, called trenchers, were laid down to hold stews and sauces, soaking up the juices until they could be eaten as part of the meal. In this way, nothing was wasted, not even the dish itself. What modern people might throw away as scraps, medieval people saw as a vital part of the meal. Even bones, after being stripped of their meat, were not discarded. They were boiled again and again to create broth, extracting every last bit of nourishment. Fat skimmed from the surface could be saved for cooking later, and marrow dug out from the hollow centers provided both calories and strength. To waste any part of the animal was unthinkable, because survival depended on using every resource to its fullest. Picture a family huddled around the hearth, the air filled with the smell of boiling broth. The mother stirs the pot, adding handfuls of barley to thicken it, while the father brings in a few wild herbs gathered from the fields. A child tears at a rough piece of bread, dipping it into the stew, while another gnaws on a bone left to simmer for days. It may not look like much, but it keeps them alive, and in that moment, it is enough. That was hack number 6, medieval food stretching tricks. Stews, porridges, and bread as plates may not sound glamorous, but they were ingenious ways of turning scarcity into sustenance. And while food kept people fed, survival required one more kind of protection. Protection against the smallest, most relentless enemies of all, insects. In the medieval world, not all threats were great armies or wild beasts. Sometimes the greatest tormentors were the smallest creatures: fleas, mosquitoes, flies, and gnats. Insects were more than just a nuisance. They carried disease, spoiled food, and tormented both people and animals. For peasants living in cottages with thatched roofs and dirt floors, or for herders watching over their livestock in the fields, insect infestations could ruin sleep, spread sickness, and even lead to famine if crops and animals suffered. But without modern sprays, screens, or netting, how did medieval people fight back? The answer was simple and ingenious: smoke. Smoke was everywhere in the medieval world. Every hearth, every fire, every forge produced it. To us, it might seem irritating, something to avoid, but for medieval people, it was a weapon against pests. They quickly discovered that the thick fumes of a smoldering fire drove insects away, keeping them from biting humans or infesting barns and storerooms. A smoky fire outside a hut could ward off mosquitoes at dusk, while smoke wafting through the rafters of a cottage discouraged fleas and other vermin. Farmers would sometimes even build small, controlled smudges of fire near their animals, allowing the drifting smoke to protect sheep and cattle from swarms of biting flies. This was not a perfect solution, but it was effective. Picture a shepherd sitting in the fields, a small pile of damp leaves and green wood smoldering beside him, the smoke curling into the air and forming a protective barrier around his flock. Or imagine a medieval family inside their one-room cottage, the fire in the hearth burning not brightly but with heavy smoke that seeped into every corner, driving out insects even as it stung their eyes. For them, the discomfort of smoke was a small price to pay compared to the misery of insects that spread sickness or attacked their food supply. In some places, people even added herbs to the smoke. Plants like rosemary, juniper, or sage were tossed onto the coals, releasing pungent smells that enhanced the repellent effect. These scents were thought not only to drive away insects, but also to purify the air of disease. While they didn't know about germs, they understood that foul air often brought illness, and so they fought back with fire and fragrance. Beyond health, smoke was also used to protect food. Meat and fish hung in smokehouses, not only preserved by the drying process, but also guarded against flies and maggots. In this way, smoke became a double tool, a preserver of food and a repeller of pests. Its role in daily survival was quiet but constant, woven into the very fabric of medieval life. So imagine a hot summer night in the Middle Ages. The air hums with insects, the kind that keep you awake and leave you itching by morning. A family gathers around their smoldering fire, letting the smoke curl around them, keeping the pests at bay. The children cough a little at the haze, but they sleep undisturbed, and in that moment smoke has done what no weapon could. It has given them peace. That was hack number 7. Smoke as insect repellent. A simple trick, born from necessity, that kept both people and animals safe from endless torment. And while smoke guarded against tiny enemies, medieval people also had to guard themselves against a far greater threat: human greed. Which brings us to the next hack: hiding valuables in plain sight. Life in the medieval world was not only threatened by the elements, hunger or disease, it was also constantly under threat from human hands. Bandits roamed roads, thieves prowled villages, and wars could erupt without warning, leaving people vulnerable to looting. For peasants, merchants, and even minor nobles, protecting one's possessions was a daily concern. Money, jewelry, tools, and even small amounts of food could be stolen, and without banks or safes, survival sometimes depended on clever concealment. This is where the art of hiding valuables in plain sight became an essential survival skill, a kind of medieval ingenuity that turned ordinary objects into protective tools. The methods were as simple as they were ingenious. For example, coins could be sewn into the hems of clothing, hidden in the linings of boots, or tucked into belts beneath layers of fabric. A traveling merchant might carry his purse inside a hollowed-out wooden staff, or hide jewels inside a seemingly ordinary bag of grain. Even the architecture of homes reflected this strategy. Floorboards could conceal small caches, chimneys could hide packages, and secret compartments in furniture were common for anyone who wanted to keep items safe from wandering eyes. What might look like an ordinary household object often held a hidden layer of protection, a clever way to survive in a world where trust was limited and theft could strike at any moment. In some communities, people took these precautions to an art form. Travelers on trade routes knew that inns were as risky as the roads themselves, and so they would hide their wealth in ways that no casual observer could detect. A belt buckle might conceal a small dagger or a pouch of coins. A hollow shoe could hide gemstones or important documents. Even everyday objects like cooking pots or barrels of food could hide items beneath their layers, making the mundane into the extraordinary. The principle was simple: make the object look unimportant, and thieves would overlook it. What was in plain sight became invisible. This skill was not just for personal survival. It could mean the difference between life and death during raids or invasions. If a band of raiders stormed through a village, those who had hidden their valuables cleverly might lose nothing, while the careless or unlucky would be stripped bare. Entire families could survive an attack with their possessions intact simply because someone knew where to conceal a few coins, a small knife, or a family heirloom. Knowledge of hiding and secrecy was as critical as the ability to fight or farm. It was a form of defense built on foresight and cunning rather than brute force. Picture a merchant walking down a muddy road, a satchel of coins dangling at his side. To the casual observer, it's just a bag of cloth scraps, but inside lies enough wealth to last weeks on the road. Or imagine a peasant family, raiders at the gate, but the most precious items, a silver ring, a small purse, the family's savings, are tucked beneath floorboards or sewn into clothing, invisible even to the trained eye. It was not luck, but planning that kept them safe. That was hack number 8, hiding valuables in plain sight. Clever concealment transformed everyday objects into lifelines, allowing people to survive not just the harshness of the environment, but the dangers of human greed. And while protecting possessions was essential, survival also depended on using animals, not just for labor or companionship, but as tools in their own right, intelligent allies that enhanced human survival in countless ways. In the medieval world, survival was never a solitary endeavor. People relied on animals in countless ways, not just for food or companionship, but as active tools that helped them endure a harsh and unpredictable environment. From the smallest hunting birds to the strongest horses, animals were integrated into daily life as indispensable partners. They were not pets in the modern sense. They were working members of the household, capable of guarding, guiding, hunting, and carrying out tasks that humans could not manage alone. Understanding how to use animals effectively was not luxury, it was a matter of survival. Dogs were perhaps the most versatile of these allies. Beyond companionship, they served as guards, alerting families to intruders or predators approaching under the cover of darkness. Herding dogs managed livestock, ensuring that sheep, goats, and cattle stayed together and out of danger, while hunting dogs tracked game over forests and fields, helping feed families that relied on the occasional kill. The skills of these dogs were as highly valued as the skills of the people who trained them. A loyal and well-trained dog could save both lives and livelihoods, preventing loss of livestock that would otherwise mean famine. Falcons and other birds of prey were another surprising but essential survival tool for the wealthy or the skilled hunter. Falconry was a highly developed practice in which birds were trained to catch small animals or birds. While it may seem like a sport, it was also a reliable source of food, especially in seasons when other sources were scarce. A skilled falconer could supplement the family's diet with birds caught by their trained raptor, a partnership between human and animal that demonstrated a deep understanding of nature and instinct. Horses, of course, were perhaps the most powerful survival tool of all. Beyond travel and transportation, horses were essential in agriculture, pulling plows and carrying heavy loads over long distances. For soldiers and messengers, horses provided mobility that could mean the difference between life and death on a battlefield or during a journey through dangerous terrain. A mounted traveler could cover miles in a day that would take a pedestrian several days to traverse, giving them access to food, shelter, or safety that might otherwise be out of reach. Even smaller livestock played crucial roles. Chickens provided eggs, which were a critical source of protein. Goats could traverse rocky terrain to find food, supplying milk where crops failed. Pigs were often used to root through the forest floor for acorns and other edible items, converting otherwise inedible matter into sustenance for humans. In each case, the animals were not passive. They were trained, guided, and utilized in ways that maximized survival potential. Picture a medieval family preparing for winter. The sheep are herded and protected by dogs, chickens cluck in their coops providing daily nourishment, and a sturdy horse carries sacks of grain from the fields to the barn. In a forest clearing, a falconer releases a bird into the sky, watching it circle before diving on unsuspecting prey, securing a meal without leaving home. Each animal is part of a carefully orchestrated system, a living tool that multiplies human effort, allowing survival against the odds. That was hack number 9, using animals as survival tools. With loyal dogs, trained falcons, sturdy horses, and hardworking livestock, medieval people leveraged the natural world itself to secure their lives. And yet, even with fire, food, medicine, and animals at their command, survival often required one final, extraordinary skill: finding one's way without the aid of maps or compasses, relying instead on nature, observation, and folk wisdom. Even with fire to keep warm, food preserved and stretched, water purified, injuries treated, and animals assisting in daily life, medieval survival still demanded one final critical skill: the ability to navigate without maps or compasses. Travel in the Middle Ages was fraught with danger. Roads were poorly maintained, often nothing more than dirt tracks through forests or fields, and travelers risked getting lost in landscapes that could be unforgiving, whether it was dense woodland, open plains, or harsh mountains. Towns were scattered, villages were isolated, and a single misstep could leave a person wandering for days, vulnerable to exposure, starvation, or hostile encounters. Yet medieval people developed remarkable techniques to find their way using only the natural world and their knowledge of the environment. One of the most important methods of navigation was celestial. The stars were guides in the night, particularly the North Star, which provided a reliable point of orientation. Experienced travelers, shepherds, and sailors memorized the constellations, using their positions to determine direction and track the passage of time. Even the sun served as a compass during the day, with its position in the sky indicating east and west. Medieval people did not simply rely on these observations. They practiced, measured, and refined them, passing their knowledge down through oral tradition and apprenticeship. A traveler unfamiliar with these signs could easily get lost, but someone skilled in celestial navigation could traverse forests, mountains, and rivers with confidence. Landmarks were equally essential. Ancient trees, unique rocks, river bends, and hilltops served as reference points for journeys both short and long. Folk wisdom often preserved the knowledge of these natural markers, guiding travelers through regions without the need for formal maps. Moss growing on the north side of trees, the direction of river currents, and even the behavior of certain birds could provide subtle but vital clues. In this way, navigation was a combination of observation, memory, and experience, a sophisticated skill honed by necessity. Travelers also relied on local knowledge. Villagers could describe routes, warn of dangerous terrain, and advise on sources of water or shelter. Pilgrimages, trade routes, and seasonal migrations ensured that this information was constantly shared and updated, forming a living network of directional intelligence. Medieval people combined these sources, stars, sun, landmarks, and human guidance, to create a survival strategy that allowed them to move safely across unfamiliar landscapes. Imagine a lone traveler leaving a village at dusk. The sky above is dotted with stars, the North Star shining steadily as a beacon. Below, a river winds through the valley, and a lone oak marks the edge of the forest. By combining these signs, the traveler moves with purpose, avoiding dangerous marshes, cliffs, or wolves, carrying both food and animals, and eventually reaching the next village just as night fully descends. For someone untrained, the same journey could mean being lost for days, exposed to the elements and hungry. Yet for the experienced medieval traveler, the world itself became a map, a living, navigable landscape. Hack number 10, then, was perhaps the culmination of all others: navigating without maps. It required observation, intelligence, and patience. A person who mastered this skill could move safely, trade goods, gather resources, and escape danger. It was the ultimate tool of independence and survival in a world where every journey carried risk.